Hi, everybody. Obviously, you've heard a lot from me over the past few days. I don't want to get into all that. I want to get into talking about metaphor and meaning, and specifically at our review and reconsideration right before spring break. You guys had asked me for some methodological insights into how I work with linguistic data or how we use linguistic data, and specifically in ethnographic projects for some of you, that's really important. And so, what I thought I would do is use my own work. And so, since we had picked this week, I had decided that we're going to look at my paper on greatness in the math core family and have a look at. You guys have read the paper, so I just want to get into now thinking about how I made the methodological decisions I made and how we get from the start of the project where I don't know anything, where I'm brand new to the program and I know nothing, to where we reach some fairly sophisticated ideas about how a conceptual network of linguistic and conceptual relations kind of coexist. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. So, all right, you guys will have read this paper, Greatness in the Math Core Family. And this is a paper that came out in 2013. I started work with the Math Core in 2008. So I've been working with them for 12 years now, and I continue to work with them. So this is the first paper that came out based on the ethnographic work that I started in '08. And it's still, I don't disagree with any of it. I think, honestly, I think this paper is a little underappreciated, but I think we always think our papers are underappreciated. Basically, it's an effort to integrate ethnographic work, participant observation and interview, and interview a perspective called corpus linguistics, which we've seen little bits of here and there throughout the course. Otto Santa Anna's paper that we already read a few weeks ago is one of the models that I was thinking about, and as I talked about a few weeks ago, I'm not a huge fan of that paper. I think it's got some problems, but it's really, really important. And then I'm using a perspective called cultural models. And cultural models are basically systems of knowledge or systems of ideas that motivate behavior. And in particular, the systems of ideas that we're talking about in this paper are metaphors, that are a set of metaphors that center around this key concept of greatness. Okay, so just a word about the program. You've read the article, so you already kind of know this. But the Math Core is a Detroit-based community of practice that focuses on mathematics enrichment, and it's a program that runs at Wayne State. It's run since 1992 for middle and high school students who go to Detroit public and charter schools, and it's based on close mentoring relationships between middle school students and their teaching assistants who are high school students, and college students who are instructors, and then some senior staff. I don't think I need to tell any of you that the state of education in Detroit is really tricky, that public education is not fantastic. But it's really important to know that the Math Core is not a remedial program, but neither is it an enrichment program that just pulls, a bunch of A students. That rather it's really pulling from throughout the entire range of what you would see in an average Detroit middle or high school class. All right, so let's get into the study and let's talk about methods and let's talk about what I did. Okay, so it started with very, very ordinary ethnographic work. In other words, I came into this program knowing nothing. I spent a lot of time initially just observing, and one of the things I spent a lot of time observing is that every morning at the Math Corps there are these almost sermon-like speeches at an event called Assembly. And every morning senior staff members get up, and it's kind of a mix of a pep rally and a variety comedy show and really, really serious social and philosophical and moral messaging. And it's, ranges in duration from about 20 minutes to about 45 minutes. And not every day has a massive amount of messaging, but there's some messaging every day. And so I became interested in this messaging, as you would do normally just by hanging out and observing and thinking critically about why in a summer camp that runs 5 or 6 hours a day, why would you spend this amount of time on this particular activity? And in just listening, I noticed that people use this word greatness an awful lot. But honestly, I really feel that this is the kind of insight that any ethnographer would recognize. If you didn't recognize that this was important to Math Corps within a couple of days, then you just aren't paying any attention at all. So I think any anthropologist coming in would have hit on this keyword and hit on its importance. What differs is what comes next. And so I started to become interested in greatness, not because that was what I had gone in thinking I would do. My background is actually in the anthropology of mathematics. I was interested in how kids learn math, and I'm still interested in that. That doesn't change. But I came to understand, as you do in a project like this, that wasn't the most important thing. And so I started by taking lots of notes and sitting there and audio recording these assemblies, which is, I think, what almost anybody would do. And at that point, I had a lot of options analytically. And so what I really chose to do was to do lexical analysis. In other words, to really dig down and dig around this one keyword of greatness. And so I basically collected and transcribed lots and lots of words, about 10 hours of spoken oration by 4 of the senior staff members who do these messages in the assemblies. But I want to point out that 10 hours isn't actually that much. That's of course cutting out all of the, other stuff. That's 10 hours of straight messaging, but that's not so much. That's not more than an average single individual can handle. And it is around 75,000 words. And basically then I would transcribe that at the word level, word for word transcriptions. And I want to say that while I did do a lot of this myself, I did have a research assistant, Monica Rodriguez, who did a ton of work on this. And I don't want to pretend, retroactively that I did all of the transcription myself, because that's simply not the case. Anyway, so now I've got about 75,000 words of moral, social, philosophical discourse, and some of that is about greatness, and some of that is not about greatness. Okay, so moving on. What I did next, because I'd already identified that greatness was something I was interested in, is identified and isolated every instance of the word greatness. There are lots of tools you can use to do this. Nowadays, people use qualitative data analysis like MaxQDA or NVivo. I use a linguistic tool called Sketch Engine. But honestly, at the time, I used Control F to find instances of the word greatness in my Word document. And then I just basically copy and pasted those individual sentences into a separate document. And there's a lot of greatness in this body of data, in this corpus. Around 2,800 words per million. And in comparison, in ordinary English spoken discourse, usually the word greatness appears about 3 to 4 words per million. So it's almost 1,000 times more common in Math Corps than it is anywhere else. Or it is at least than it is in sort of general American English. But again, that's not super surprising. We already knew that. Anyone at Math Corps could have told me that, and like I say, if I didn't notice that, I wouldn't have known anything. That tells me it's culturally relevant, it tells me it's important, but it doesn't tell me much more. And next what I did, and I used the KWIC, or QUIC approach, which stands for keyword in context. And basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at the context of the use of the word. And so basically what I'm doing is looking at each sentence, sentence by sentence, and coding each sentence in terms of a set of conceptual or metaphorical relationships that appear a lot. And so you have seen that there's a chart in the article that lists a bunch of key relationships. So for instance, there's one that could be greatness is visible. And this is where greatness collocates or co-occurs with verbs like see or show or shine or look or make manifest, and so on. So it's not any one specific word. The conceptual relationship is a higher level concept. It's basically what underlies all of these lexical relationships. And so basically what I'm doing is I'm taking the conceptual metaphor analysis that people like Lakoff and Johnson do in the article that you guys read, combining it with lexical analysis to see what these relationships are and to find the ones that are the most common. Now, what was really important, though, was not just that they occur, that there are 8 or so relationships that are really common, but that those relationships build into a network or a cultural model of beliefs or ideas. In other words, they occur in a way that suggests that they're interrelated with one another. So the question, though, that I think we often need to ask as ethnographers, once we do something and we find something that we think is interesting, I think it's really important to note that we have no reason to know at this point whether it's unusual. So the next question that I think we must ask is the Math Corps conceptualization of greatness different than its use in ordinary spoken American English? We know it's more common, we already know that, but is it different? Are the relationships that I found at Math Corps different than the ones that you would find in ordinary spoken or written or any other kind of American English? And so this is where I actually turned from my own data set and went to some large published data sets, in this case, which is the Corpus of Contemporary American English, or COCA. And I wanted to know, okay, well, how do people talk about greatness out there in the world? And what was really interesting is that there, the most common verbs that people use in association with greatness is something that you achieve, or greatness is something that you're destined for. And what's really striking is that these really, really common things out there in the outside world at Math Corps basically never happen. So at Math Corps, we have these other set of relationships. So the idea of greatness being a property of an individual that's inside of them, that is demanded, and that staff demand to see it, that they believe it's inside of each and every person. That greatness is universal and unique to each person. So this is a set of relationships that actually don't occur out in ordinary English. And that's actually really, really important, and it's something that I don't think that anthropologists do often enough, is that little comparative turn to ask, is what I'm finding actually different than what I would have found if I did a different study? So another point of comparison is that in American English, greatness is a property of many sorts of entities. If you go and look at greatness and what people talk about greatness, people will talk about the greatness of God, the greatness of America, nation, country. So these are two sets of relationships that greatness is talked about all the time in ordinary American English. But at Math Corps, greatness is only the property of individual humans, of specific humans, and it's specifically addressed at kids, right? And this really provided me some powerful evidence for a local, specific, shared cultural model that contrasts with the kind of cultural model to which people would be exposed outside the Math Corps program itself. And that suggested that I was onto something important. Now, I could have stopped there. I showed a difference. I could do some statistics. I did some statistics. You saw it. It was interesting. But it was really important to note that those 75,000 words came from only 4 people. And these were 4 prominent senior staff members. They were adults. They hadn't really, there was no reason to think that this was shared by everyone in the Math Corps. And so then I wanted to ask, is this something that the hearers, the audience, would internalize in some way? Because if they're sending messages and the students aren't getting them, then that really isn't evidence of much of anything. So this then informed my ethnography. And so I first really would, and for some of you know a lot about survey methodology and writing good interview questions, but one of the first kinds of questions that I used to elicit information about greatness were questions like, what are the values that Math Corps represents to you? You don't want to prime your consultants by asking them about greatness right away. What does greatness mean to you? It's not a great first interview question. But if you talk about like what's Math Corps all about, or what are the values of the Math Corps, that's a much stronger way to prompt people to think. And what I really found was that the discourse about greatness from those interviews directly paralleled the 8 conceptual relationships that I had found from the assemblies. And so eventually, of course, in follow-ups, I got around to probing specifically around the concept of greatness, but I didn't jump right into that because I really wanted to see whether it would come out on its own, and really what I found is that it did. A side note, but a really important one, is that I was also really interested in the gestural and visual correlates of the words. So for instance, there's this idea of greatness as a struggle. And it's really central to understanding greatness, that it's not that greatness is something that you're destined for and it's going to happen no matter what. And it's that greatness is going to be hard, and it's a path, and it's going to have difficulties. And so there's this gestural framework where the staff would talk about greatness, and they would use this kind of up and down gestural motion, basically visualizing a graph. And this is a math program. It shouldn't be too surprising, I guess, that there'd be a mathematical metaphor of the idea of not shooting straight up like this, but greatness as something that has ups and downs. This becomes important later as we're conceptualizing not just success, but also conceptualizing failure. And at that point, and by the way, also we saw, and you saw in the article, that there's a nice poster that has that same kind of up and down linear progress that exemplifies that idea of greatness as a struggle. And so what we saw is that the principles of the program aren't just being reflected linguistically, they're also being reflected in sort of a multimodal perspective, using gesture and using visual representation as 2 additional ways in which these ideas are encoded. And in fact, when I started to see kids make that greatness gesture, and I think I talk about an example where that kid makes that little motion, I started to really realize that something was going on here that was more than just somebody casually using some words, that something was going on here that was much more important than simply a bunch of words spoken in the morning and then forgotten by the afternoon. And then at that point, I again could have been done. I could have said, I'm done. I don't want to know any more about this. But I started to wonder, like, what else is going on that's common at the Math Corps? What are other words that are used in the assemblies? Maybe there are similar associations for other words that I hadn't paid attention to. Greatness was so important that I was really concerned that I was missing something else, that there was some other lexical association or conceptual association that was related to it, but that it wasn't associated with the word greatness. And so because I'd done that pinpoint focus on one word, the question occurred, well, what was I missing? What didn't I get? And so one of the things that really puzzled me for a while was that greatness is super, super common, as talked about, but as noted in the paper, the word great is not. Only around 1.5 times as common as it is in ordinary English. That's not really significant. So this really weird fact emerges, that you have this program where kids are very, very often told you have greatness inside you, but are rarely told you're great. I tell my kid that he's great all the time. And so what gives? How does this make sense? Well, eventually I came back to the answer because I started to think about the relationships that I was talking about to begin with in this greatness cultural model. And four of them are ones that I've highlighted here. Greatness is a struggle, greatness is universal, greatness is inside a person, and greatness is visible. So if you tell a kid, all right, you're great. I see the greatness inside you. I believe the greatness is inside of you because it's inside everybody, and I demand to see it. And you also then inevitably, as we all do, they're going to mess up. This is a math program. You don't learn mathematics except by making errors. And if you've told kids that, they're going to conclude either that you're unreliable or that you're lying to them when you tell them that they have greatness inside them. If that's all you tell them, oh, you're great, you're great, you're great. Well, now you're not so great. And this is a really vulnerable student population. Detroit middle school students, we know that from prior literature that African American students, and particularly African American girls, are extremely vulnerable to threats to their self-esteem with regard to science and mathematics. And in contrast, at Math Corps, if you say that regardless of what you do or achieve, you still have greatness inside you, it's there all the time. Because it's not about achieving anything or being destined for anything. It's a struggle, and it's not a constant upward progression. It's not about saying, well, just do whatever you want, be great, be not great, doesn't matter. But it's a way of saying, like, no, you have greatness inside of you. But we also know that despite that, you are going to fail again and again and again. And then that really led me to look back over those assemblies in a whole new light and realize that they're largely about helping students make sense of failure. Now, this is a really weird thing to talk about a lot at a math program, but it's absolutely what happens. Is people spend a lot of time talking about failure and talking about success in light of failure. And then what that got me to thinking, and that drew me back to the literature, and that drew me back to the ideas promoted by the social developmental psychologist Carol Dweck, who has this concept of growth mindset. Now, if any of you have been anywhere near an educational setting in the K-12 environment in the past 15 years or so, you've encountered this idea of growth mindset. It's the idea that praise for students' hard work or students' effort is better than praise for students' innate ability. If you say you're so smart, then what happens if a student screws up? Well, maybe I wasn't so smart. But if you say, that was a really great job you did, you worked really hard on that, and I can see how you're making that effort, then you're not targeting something that's presumed to be an innate ability. Notably, and I'm still baffled by this to this day, none of the staff in the Math Corps knew the concept of growth mindset at the time before I showed up. They certainly do now. It basically is fundamental to a lot of our ongoing research that we do at the Math Corps. But basically, by focusing in on a single lexical item, this single word, greatness, I was able to elicit then a cultural model, this network of conceptual relationships that relies on these metaphors. And then to show how it facilitates growth mindset, because it produces an environment where kids are encouraged explicitly to believe in their own potential and think about their successes and failures in a healthy way. All right. So just to wrap up, I'd be very happy to answer any further questions that any of you would have in your focus or open question prompts or anywhere else. I kind of tried to go over that article, which I know you all already read, in a little bit of a more personal and detail, thinking about why I made the decisions I did. They're not the only decisions I could have made, and I don't want to present this as a notion of, well, the published article was the only thing that could have happened, because I don't think that was the case. But I do think that it's that attention to specific linguistic detail and the question of what could somebody have said differently? Instead of saying destined for greatness or achieve greatness, to talk about greatness as a path or greatness as a struggle. Those are different conceptual relationships. And once you're aware of those differences, you're able to think analytically about the choices that people make and what those consequences are. All right, I'll wrap it up here. Looking forward to your questions. Thanks, everyone.